Welcome to the 52 Love Podcast, your show for 52 lessons in 52 weeks. Before we dive in, remember you can find the audio version of this episode, along with the rest of the series, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and Radio Public. And now, here's your host, Ms. Tonya Todd.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the 52 Love Podcast. I'm your host, Tonya Todd. 52 Love began as a blog series last year, 52 Love Lessons in 52 Weeks. This year, we are exploring each of those tips with a new guest each week. And this week's tip is a little less romantic than some of the others. We are going to talk about voting with your partner. And though it's not the most romantic, it is very intimate. And here to talk about it are my guests, Steven and Amanda Skenandore. Would you like to introduce yourselves and tell us what you do?
Hi, we're thrilled to be on the show, Tanya. Thank you. I'm Amanda Skenandore. I'm a historical fiction author and a registered nurse.
And I'm Steven Skenandore. I am a detective sergeant here in Vegas.
Well, why don't we talk about this week's tip and what it means to you to vote together? Is it something that you did before I asked you, which I know the answer to already because you were my poster children. But for those who don't know you, talk about what voting means to the two of you as a couple.
So I think we've been certainly been going to the polls together for several election cycles. But even beyond that, even before we were dating, when we first were kind of acquaintances, friends, politics and the election, it was the 2020 election. It was the first time both of us being able to vote in a presidential election, and we were both very interested and active in the election. We voted for different people, but I feel like it was a chance for us to get to know each other better. Even though we were voting for different people, sort of a common ground that we had, that we were both interested in it, and that interest just
which election was that?
2020.
2000.
Oh my gosh, 2000.
Yeah.
I was like, what?
Yeah.
You're like, wait a minute.
2000, yeah.
I'm glad I asked because I swear she said 2020, but she's saying things that sound like they were not last year.
No, sorry.
Dating ourselves is
go back a few decades.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't date you at all. Okay, so now that we rewound, it's the 2000 election.
Yeah.
So go back to what you were saying.
Yes. Oh, and simply that it was like I said, it was a way for us to get to know each other better and a point of connection. That this was something that we both felt passionately about, even if we didn't feel passionately about it in the same way.
So what do you mean by it was a point of connection?
I'll try to jump in a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was my first election. Maybe I did some voting in the midterm just prior to that. I can't actually remember that, but this was certainly the most important one, the first really important one, the first presidential election I was ever able to vote in. And we're both students at UNLV, both living on the same floor.
In the dorms.
Yeah. We're watching the debates together. I mean, we were, we're watching we were just involved in this whole thing together, and, we became close over that. I mean, I can tell you, like she said, we voted for two different people, and this is well before we were ever dating. It's just, I remember that, so I voted for Ralph Nader, and she was unhappy that she thought that this caused the loss of Al Gore, right? And
that and the hanging chads, but yes.
Yes. And so it's funny because when I was thinking about when we were going to do this, I remembered this story. Her and our mutual friend Jordan were very unhappy with me about this, and thought I was very naive to have voted for a third party candidate. And whatever the case was. So
you are a naive college student without all of
yes,
their college student wisdom.
Incredibly idealistic. Yes. Yeah. And they were wiser than me, certainly, because I I agree with them now. I've come to, think that was not the most pragmatic.
It's all about our perspective.
True. Yes.
Yeah.
But it's funny because I wrote them a little letter, right? I wrote them a little letter that was explaining my position.
Really into this.
Yes, I know. It was really important. Yeah. But I wrote them both a letter because I thought that my ability to articulate it in the moment was not as good as me sitting down, considering it, and laying out the reasons for why I did what I did. And, I don't know. It was that's how that's how you won her heart, because
she's a fan of letters.
That's true. That's true.
And I have to say, I think again, it didn't. I mean, obviously it mattered a little, and I felt like it mattered a lot in the moment, right, when they're recounting Florida, who Steven voted for, but really
it was all his fault,
right? But I have to say, it really impressed me about him. This is someone that cares about things, beyond himself, beyond playing video games, beyond just studying, about the world, and is thoughtful about things. And that it really impressed me, and it stuck with me. And we kind of just then, I think, carried that over and continued to share, our opinions with each other. He's always helping me stay, I think, on top of things, or maybe just one step behind things, that are happening in the world. And I really appreciate that, because there is so much to kind of see, and he's got a great mind for that. And when election time rolls around, I'm really focused on local stuff, and I'll research the referendums and the amendments and the judges, and so then I can help bring that explanation to the table, as we're literally going through the ballot booklet. And again, we're not necessarily saying, well, I'm going to vote this way or that way, but sharing our thoughts on the subject.
Every once in a while on this show, I will get this moment where I just get a little chill of, ooh, I really picked the best couple for this particular tip. You just gave that to me. I didn't know all these background details. The reason I invited the two of you to do this particular tip, I usually assign a tip for someone and have them try it, see how it works for them as a couple, and then they share their experience about how it worked. Well, I came up with this tip on my own, but I saw a picture that Amanda posted last year of the two of you voting together. And it was just a gorgeous shot of the two of you. And it encapsulated everything that I wanted this blog post to mean, this particular tip. And it was just, they are the poster children for this. I asked her permission if I could use it as the photo for the blog. And she said yes. And when it became, at that point, it still wasn't in the plans to become a podcast. But as soon as I became a podcast host, I was like, I need you two for this tip. And it's 11 months away, but I'd like to book it now.
Yeah. We booked very far out.
Sure.
Yes. Yes, I book very far out. So what are your plans for this voting cycle?
So, I think this next month is not a big voting cycle here in Nevada, but certainly 2022 will be. And we'll be, I think, again, kind of helping each other as we see things about the different candidates and see other races. I know this might not be a popular thing, but, we'll look at other races around the country and see where they need funds, and we'll send them funds, to kind of, to help, shape the vision of America that we think will be a better America.
Well, that's interesting. You don't just focus on what's in your local community. You obviously do care a great deal about that, but that's not where your interest ends.
Yeah. And that's, I think, something new last year. We, beyond presidential things, we had just always focused, who is our senator, who is our congressperson. But with such slim margins in the, you know, national legislature, it seems important. Sometimes some of these other races matter, and they did matter in 2020.
Yeah, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit further. We thought we wanted to contribute to different, I guess, different state Senate candidates. And so we thought, okay, well, how much money can we actually spend to do this? And, you know, we ended up coming up with a number, and then we kind of floated the idea that, okay, how can maybe we can make this like a matching thing, and we can send out an email to our family and friends and people that we know we're not, you know, with no judgment, very clearly, with no judgment. Yeah. We will match anything you put on these particular candidates. It was very close Senate races that we wanted to support, and we prioritized those over ones that we like, for example, most wished for, but we didn't think were very likely. We prioritized ones that we thought actually were very close and that we might help tip the balance, right? And so that's kind of what we did as a strategy. We sent out this email to, I don't know, probably 15 people or something like that, and said, we will match anything you do up to this on these candidates. Let us know, send us that you sent something there, and we will match it.
And nothing is too small, right?
Yeah, you know, for sure. And what was neat is we then had, I think it was 2 other people say, you know what, we're in, we'll match anything else anybody else gives.
Yeah. So you inspired others.
Yes. Yeah. It multiplied itself several times over, and it was a total success.
It was so
I was
neat.
So surprised by it, you know?
Because we were really nervous, right? Like, it's one thing to, I think, have political discussions with the person, your partner, right? But then to sort of, you know, float it out to your family and,
outside the safety of your home.
Yeah, right? You know, we didn't want to offend anyone. We didn't want to create any ill will or anything like that. And politics is delicate enough, and there's a lot of tension and, I think, ugliness to it. We didn't want to add anything like that to what was already there. We just wanted to raise money for something that we thought was important, and it turned out to be so inspiring for us, like, to see that people were also enthusiastic about it, and to feel like we were making a difference, or even if we didn't make a difference, because you know, we, of course, watched the election results that evening, and it wasn't clear whether or not this money that we had raised was going to make a difference. But I still felt like we saw something that we wanted to contribute to, and we took a step. We were active. We didn't just, you know, give up and say, you know, like, my vote doesn't matter, or this doesn't matter. Even just trying to do that and getting other people to do that, it felt like a win regardless.
I do want to, you've prompted 2 thoughts here. Number 1, do you think of yourself as an activist?
Yes.
Yeah. And
I mean, you obviously are, but not everyone thinks of themselves that way. So I was curious, do you define yourself that way?
Yes.
And
we do. So, like, beyond voting, we went to the Women's March together in 2017. And we've done other, like, lots of other, like, local marches.
That's fantastic.
The only time we traveled, but, like, I think that's very, you know, even beyond voting, I actually would say, like, doing something like that with your partner. And it's not always, like, sometimes it's a cause that's really important to me and maybe, like, sort of important to Steven, or vice versa. But there's something about the other person, like, physically showing up with you. That's incredible. That just makes you feel so supportive, so loved, so heard, you know, that they recognize what's important to you. And, you know, and they're willing to like, literally stand beside you. So I will say that's, you know, to, I guess, add a second thing onto the vote together, I would say, like, march together.
March together. I love that. Yeah. That is actually one of the tips that was inspired by some of the protests last year.
Wonderful.
It was, you know, it was a challenge to continue the blog posts amid all of the things that were going on last year. Yeah. And when the universe was telling me, keep going, I was inspired to write one about do something for charity together, march together, protest together, give together, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, and it might be that you let your partner choose a cause and you support your partner with that cause, or it might be something that matters to both of you and you go out and you fight together, but it does bring you closer together.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you would be the poster child for that one too.
No, I think that's really important. I mean, I actually had a little memory pop up on my Facebook post of, I think it was 5 years ago or something, but we were, Amanda really wanted to try to go out there and encourage people to vote, but she didn't, but she was very apprehensive about knocking on somebody's door and talking to them about voting or whatever. And so she asked me to come with her and do this with her. And so we did. We spent a couple of days going out there and knocking on some doors, and we kind of got a little bit of teaching from the folks at the headquarters or whatever about how to go about doing this, and
just letting people know, like, these are the dates of early voting. This is how you early vote. This is how you can mail vote, etc.
Yeah.
Which isn't influencing them what way to vote. It's just, hey, I'm making sure you know the options, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there's also, I mean, for example, me and my whole family, Amanda wasn't able to make it out there, but we went to Standing Rock when there was the Standing Rock protests going on out there. That was a very big issue for me, an issue very close to my heart. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know. I just, I mean, I know that.
Can you share it with us for those who don't know?
Yes, what the protest was about and whatnot. Yeah, so it was about, if folks maybe will remember, the pipeline that was going through the Missouri River just north of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. The fight over that was, everybody kind of had their own different reasons for being there and whatnot, but the fight over it for me was that the original plan was that the pipeline would go across the Missouri River in the exact same way north of Bismarck. And when Bismarck thought that that was an unsafe thing for their water to have as a threat to them, they moved it south, and they moved it so that it would affect the water of the Standing Rock natives out there. And so when the natives of Standing Rock saw the same problems with the safety of that, those concerns were disregarded. And there was also issues about the land. There was issues about, just different environmental concerns. And this is also, I think, maybe folks may remember where they're spraying water on protests and, freezing temperatures. This is that issue. We were actually there for those days. I wasn't one of the frontline folks on that. My brother was, but that's the issue. That was the activism that we took on those days. And like I said, Amanda wasn't able to be there, but I don't know. I think when we find things that are going to be very important to us, I think that we try to not just be people on the sidelines of that, but that we do try to affect change.
I love how you incorporate your families into this, that it's not just the two of you. You know that you're stronger with your family involved,
No doubt.
And that brings me to the other thing that you triggered earlier, Amanda, that you were saying you didn't think that you made a difference, but obviously you did. Maybe it didn't affect the change you wanted for the election, but you involved other people. And every time you do that, you get them thinking about this stuff, and you don't know who they're talking to and who it's going to affect in their immediate circles and where this ripple will go. You did make a difference. You just maybe can't see it.
Yeah. That's true. Thank you. That's a really great way to think about that.
You also mentioned that you do a lot of research before you vote. Do you two do that together, or is that part of your love of research?
So, I think that Steven he's just an avid reader. So he's always reading about like national issues. But then you go to vote, and at least here in Nevada, there were 30 or 40 judges that were on our election ballot last year. I mean, that's just, how do you find information about these things? And so sometimes I think that's a little bit harder, but I hate to go and vote for someone that I know nothing about. Right. So then so I kind of take on that role, and I look for, the Nevada Independent, of course, is a wonderful place to find information, any election cycle, locally about those sorts of things. So I'm looking there. I'm looking at other statements that have come out. Sometimes, when it's like small candidates for like council people or our, state assembly or Senate, like then you can find, sometimes they'll fill out interviews. So I'm like trying to find those sorts of things to kind of, and then sort of sharing that with Steven. I also will share that with my friends. Some of the friends that ask, I'll share what they'll like say to Amanda, who are you voting for? But I always say, well, I try to tell them the whole thing. Like, I'm doing this because I saw this and I read this and that kind of thing.
Yeah. One of the things I particularly love about the two of you that I'm hearing just in these few minutes is that you are so passionate about these causes, but you're not trying to sway people to vote with you. You're just trying to get them involved and give them the information. And, fingers crossed, they agree with you, but that's not your goal. Your goal is not to get them to agree with you. Your goal is to get them to be part of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And to be informed enough to be a productive part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe I would rephrase it just a little bit, is that we, or at least just for me, I think that I want to persuade them to a certain, I want to persuade them. I don't want to browbeat anybody. I don't, I want them to come to their own conclusions about certain things, but I also just don't want to be somebody who is constantly avoiding those, talking about those tough issues and stuff like that. Like, I want to be able to talk to them. I do want to persuade them. I don't want to shame somebody into voting one way or browbeat them, like I said, into voting one way, but I do, want to educate the folks into things that I've learned or whatever the case is. And like I said, we spend time trying to understand these issues, and we do discuss those quite a bit. Yeah.
So before we move on to discussing Amanda's books, do you have anything you would like to say to persuade the viewers and the listeners?
Oh.
Now's your chance, Steven.
Oh man. Well, I think if you want to educate yourself about local politics, like you said, it's like she said, it's very difficult to do that. One thing I will say is the Nevada Independent is such an incredible resource. I mean, to learn about these 30 judges, they brought together several different attorneys that work with these folks, and judges, they brought different other judges that are colleagues of these folks, and they
law professors,
asked them certain questions to help understand how they would judge and how we would, how we as a society are to come to expect what they're going to do in that position. I mean, there's no other place you could have gotten that. There's no other place, you know what I mean? Unless you personally met all of these folks, and that's
a challenge.
Possibility, yeah. So, I mean, that would be one thing I would suggest is to use them. I don't know, the RJ maybe is a little bit more general, but they are investigative journalism, very in-depth reporting on local issues.
The Nevada Independent.
The Nevada Independent.
He's not speaking about the RJ.
Yes, the Nevada Independent. Yeah, it's fairly new. I mean, I want to say that they launched 3 years ago or 4 years ago or something like that, and we find them to be an invaluable resource.
Yeah.
And then I just have you just prompted another thing that I'd like to ask you about, Steven.
Yes.
Amanda shared with us how she feels more connected to you by going through this process and discussing these matters together, but I'd like to hear your side of that.
Yes, so she does go through and do a lot of research on these local things. I think one thing she did leave out that I'll add is that when there's referendum in particular, when there's these referendums that come up, we do discuss that pretty in depth, each one of them. Every 4 years or so, there's always I don't know, 4 or 6 or 7 referendums that come up, and I think we do those we do discuss very in depth and try to, I don't know,
parse out the language because it's pretty opaque.
Yes.
Intentionally.
Yes, very true.
Yeah.
What do you do when you disagree? How do you handle it?
We've evolved, I will say.
I guess I haven't written her a letter recently like we did that first time.
And the first big argument that we got in was about that 2000 election, actually. After the fact, way after the fact, like 3 or 4 years.
So after you were a couple, you got into an argument?
Yeah, after, I mean, Bush was already president for several years, so we got into a big argument about that. But you know what, I think that was a good lesson, you know, and I'm kind of happy that it happened early in our relationship, because I think politics can get really ugly, and somehow it's easy to attack the person, right? Mm-hmm. And that was a lesson, I think, for me, because I was definitely in the wrong in this particular argument. And you know, like,
we have it on record.
This one time. But you know, like, don't take it to that level, to that personal level where you're attacking someone's character or, you know, belief system, right? Like, mm-hmm. you can have these conversations in a positive way, that can bring you closer together. But that was definitely a lesson I think we had to learn early on, because there is a tendency just when you care so much about something, I think, to go too far. So, you know, I would say now, since then, we've done a lot better.
For sure.
With our political disagreements. And we, you know, I mean, the others have come up over the years. And I think the other part of that, about not taking it personally, is sometimes there's a feeling of, well, if you don't support this issue, or you don't support this candidate, you don't support me, or, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that's so limited of a view, right? Like, it's not fair to put that on the other person when they have a myriad of other reasons that they are looking at it in a different way or supporting a different thing, not because they don't love you or don't care about you, right? And you know, and that's also something that we have had to learn.
Yeah, we'll read this every once in a while. We'll read this column called The Ethicist, and what they'll do is people will write in and they'll give these ethical dilemmas, and they'll ask this person who, you know, tries to answer these things, what the response is. And, you know, one thing we try to do when we do that, and I think this is good, like, prep for us when we do disagree on certain things, is to identify when there are very valuable interests at stake that are competing against one another. You know what I mean? Whether that be honesty on one side, and also just kindness on the other. For example, if you're asking, right, you know, I don't know what they could be, but in any difficult question, there are going to be, you know, competing interests that are both going to be very valuable, and people are going to weigh those values quite differently, and that's oftentimes how they come to different conclusions. And like she said, I mean, that's part of I think what's causing a lot of friction nationally and about all this stuff is just, we try to make out the other person to be evil in some way. And that's obviously not the case. It's just, you know, the values of these competing interests are weighed differently. And, you know, I think to have the humility to understand that somebody can just think or believe differently than you, and not to, you know, ostracize them because of that. I think that's, I don't know. Yeah.
Do the two of you have any rituals for after you vote together?
We wear the sticker, we take a picture.
Yeah.
You know, small things I can remember.
I did really like in your blog post, Tonya, though, I really like that you mentioned, like, to make kind of an event of it, and you know, maybe go to dinner afterward, or you know, certainly I suppose a ritual that happens afterward is we watch the election together. We watch the results. Kind of obsessively.
We created a little war room, and we got a computer up, and I got, you know,
so that we can see beyond what's on the TV, like what are other people saying?
It's true.
But you do make a night of it.
We do. Yeah.
It's not, well, that's done. Let's go home and watch TV.
We make a night of it.
I find that ice cream is always a nice treat after you vote.
Yes. I like that.
Of course, I like ice cream after pretty much anything I do.
Ice cream after, that's a great after everything.
Ice cream after ice cream, yes. So let's talk about your books, Amanda. What is the most recent book that you have published?
My most recent book is The Second Life of Muriel West. It's a story about a woman who's unexpectedly diagnosed with leprosy in the 1920s and her experience at a quarantine hospital in Louisiana.
Now, what prompted you to write a story about that?
So I think with all of my books, I'm interested in parts of history that I didn't know about or that I knew very little about. And certainly leprosy in America was something I knew nothing about, even being a registered nurse. But beyond that, I think what really struck me about this particular book was the stigma of the disease and how much weight that stigma was given, even above the science, and that, then the resulting injustice. And so that's definitely something I think that sort of carries through with all of my books is, again, it's something that I didn't know, something that I didn't learn in my history classes, but just that seems really relevant to today. Like I said, I write historical fiction, but I think the past has a lot to tell us and show us about our lives today. So I try to find those things that, at least for me, are, I think, helping me see my present day life with a little bit more clarity.
So what did you learn that prompted you to write the other books?
My first book, Between Earth and Sky, is about the Native American boarding schools that the government had set up around beginning at the latter part of the 19th century all the way through the beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, the horrible fallout from that, all of the ways that the government and the people involved, it wasn't just the government, but robbed generations of Native American children of their culture and their identity and their sense of self in a very intentional way. And so again, that was something that I had never heard about and thought, oh my gosh, and again, something that you can see just still affecting us today.
Right, because you wrote that book before it came out in the news. Yes.
Yeah, that book came out in 2018. So before all of this, yes, about the mass graves. So it was unfortunate. I read that, about what they found in Canada, and I'm sure what we'll find here. And it was not at all surprising to me that
unfortunately
existed.
The other thing too about the origins of that book is that my mom was in a boarding school, and so she talked with my mom about being in Indian boarding school, and that she was so surprised that existed, and so surprised that was happening, and so
or this recent.
Yes, right, yes,
very true. Yeah, we think of that as history, but it's right. My mother. So
yeah, I think that because I was with his mother when I saw these pictures of these kids in military garb that had been at a boarding school, and I said, "What is this?" And she explained it to me, and I think that was part of this feeling of I know nothing about this, but for her, it was just this very sad reality. Yes, yeah. And that dichotomy really struck me. That is not fair for Native Americans to bear the weight of this completely, this horrible truth. I don't know, there needs to be a more collective reckoning with that.
And it shouldn't be that we're just now finding out about these things. This is not something that should have been swept under the carpet for centuries. It's amazing to me the things that we're still learning. Yeah, which brings me to your second book. What was that book?
Yeah, and that book is probably the most. It is not political, but it is about political things and voting. It's called The Undertaker's Assistant, and it's set in New Orleans in the Reconstruction era, so 1876, right as all of the progress that had been made during Reconstruction, where you had African-American senators, assemblymen, statesmen, both on the national and local levels. And then this systematic terror that white people sort of came through and swept all of that away in this very, very quick, horrific kind of wave that then, of course, resulted in Jim Crow and, 100 years plus. It's still going on. The voter disenfranchisement is still going on, but so that was something I learned so much about the Civil War, and there was nothing about Reconstruction except these kind of throw-offs about carpetbaggers and things like that, and this, you know, this perception of greed, and that's why that the Reconstruction governments failed, and you know that's just not true. And you know, and the more I was sort of digging into that, the more I thought, you know, how come, you know, I can name these Civil War generals or these battlefields, but I can't name these amazing senators like PBS Pinchback. He was the governor of Louisiana in 1872. Like, that's amazing. He was a free man of color before the war. Like, these are American heroes. Why aren't we learning about them? And so that's a little bit what the book encompasses.
I read in the Review Journal, someone, I think it was Scott Dickensheets, wrote that you seem to have this, I don't know, like you have a psychic ability to predict these things that we're going to uncover in our history. And it makes me a little worried about what's your next book going to be? Like, what do we need to prepare for now?
I don't think my next book is prescient at all. My next book is a lighter, you know, I wrote it during the pandemic. And so I wanted to like read lighter things. So I wrote something that's a bit lighter too.
Are you allowed to share anything about the topic?
Yes, it's the called The Nurse's Secret, and it's about the first nursing school in America in 1880s New York at Bellevue Hospital. But it's actually kind of centered around a thief in hiding at the school who uncovers a murder. So it's a little bit of a murder mystery at this hospital.
That's a word you don't want to hear from a prescient author.
Yes. Yes.
Is there any element of things that you hadn't known from history in this book too? Does it follow that theme, or is it separate from that?
You know, a little bit. I think I being a nurse, I was sort of interested in our origin story, if you will. And, you know, it's very, a little bit surprised to know, like in the beginning, nurses were just, I mean, they were recruited from like workhouses and prisons. They, you know, were drunks. They would steal the patient's medicines. And then when there was this transformation, they kind of, I would say, overshot a little bit and became like a very, very narrow definition of what then would make a good nurse. And that was someone that was, of course, Christian, and that was not married and certainly not divorced, and, you know, was of good breeding. And so then you kind of, and of course, also a woman and, you know, heterosexual, all of these very narrow things, white, you know, like just so, right. And then I think we've spent a lot of time nursing, overcoming that. And then also overcoming this at the same time, right? You have the medical community, doctors who are men, and they're very threatened by this emergence of all of a sudden nurses who know a little bit about medicine, and they're afraid they're going to, you know, try to whittle their way into, or weasel their way into becoming doctors, and they don't want that. And so then you develop this very disproportionately weighted system of, you know, complete obedience that the nurses must have for the physicians. And I still, that is still something that we're struggling also with today. So in that way, I was interested in, but they were things that were new to me and interesting. I hope they'll be interesting to a broader audience as well.
Sounds fascinating. It really does. So before we wrap up, it occurred to me while you were going through that the two of you, it's because you mentioned that you were a nurse and you happen to be a nurse of infectious disease, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Steven, you're a police officer. So we just, you know, this historic year that we just, that we're still kind of like hanging on to.
Yeah.
How did the two of you find a way to stick together and help each other through that?
You know, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think about the George Floyd protests that we had last year, and man, that was taxing, and it was a lot of work, and it was a lot of you know, it was a tough time, you know what I mean, for this country and for us, and and I think of then the beginning of the pandemic and the amount of Amanda, would generally work as a nurse, maybe 1 or 2 days a week leading up to that. But then this pandemic hit, and she is a full-time nurse on the front lines dealing with this pandemic.
Right.
And yeah,
because you were taking a step back to write more, weren't you?
Yeah. Didn't really materialize.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're right to think that is what occurred. I mean, I guess it was, to me, even you just bringing it up, I had kind of forgotten about that a little bit, because we're back to, something more akin to what's normal, or maybe we've normalized what's been happening. But
yeah, I think that's
it was a difficult year. Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
No, it had to be taxing on the two of you, but I look at your
sure,
smiling faces. You obviously made it through. What is your secret? Because I can't imagine the situation being any more challenging for you two. Like, you had to deal with it on so many different ends.
What do you think, Ben?
I think recognizing, I don't want to get too far afield here, but, brought up, or I suppose you brought up George Floyd, right? Like, we 100% support those protests too, right? So it's this, but at the same time, it's also Steven's job to be on the other side of that protest, right? So it's a tricky place. And I think recognizing that there is a struggle kind of on top of a struggle, if that makes sense. And then just
it does, and it goes to what Steven was saying, that there can be valid points on both sides of issues, and you need to look at all of the aspects of it. And then to add that you are also a police officer of color. You're not, like, you have that intersection going into it as well.
Yeah. It's funny because when I think about the Standing Rock protests that I talked about earlier, people would ask me, okay, how can you as a police officer be going up there, and, and how do I deal with that being on the other side, or how do I deal with that? And I thought, well, what I would tell people is, well, the thing about that issue, the thing about the pipeline issue, is that the police are not the enemy, are not the thing that we're trying to stop from occurring. They weren't the issue. You know what I mean? Like, in some ways they became the issue because you saw very, viral videos about their tactics and whatnot, but they weren't the issue. They weren't our opposition. The opposition was this pipeline. You know what I mean? Like, that was kind of the issue. But that was not what had occurred with George Floyd, right? I mean, that was, we were the issue. We were the thing that needed to be, that the community, that society was trying to change and trying to adjust. And, and with Amanda too, it was, you're right, to think it was very mentally challenging, because, people were in disbelief also, and continue to be in disbelief of people who were, not believing numbers that people are dying of this, of this pandemic. And I mean, I'm like, my wife's the one that's reporting these numbers to this, you know what I mean? Like,
this is not some news station that is.
So I don't know. I mean, just, a lot of support for each other. I mean, certainly she supported me, and certainly, it's tough too. I think talking about these issues are really important. Her sister and all her young friends, it was probably a group of, I don't know.
Our nieces and their pod.
Exactly. Yeah. They wanted to ask me about really difficult questions about what police officers do, and I obviously made time.
In Minnesota.
Yes, so they live right in Minnesota. Right in Minneapolis. And so I mean, talking about that and talking about some of the hard truths about
sounds like they were blessed to have you as a resource.
I hope so. I hope I had the right words. I hope I didn't want to make them think that the world is perfect, and I didn't want to shield them from understanding how difficult life is, but I hope so. I hope I had the right words. Yeah.
And I think sometimes that support can be like not talking about it too, just understanding like that Steven, is being asked by so many people because he's in this sort of unique, like you said,
Right.
intersection, and that letting the home be a space where
He can breathe.
Sometimes we don't talk about that, Yeah. So, and then he would let me just talk about the COVID numbers all the time.
That's one way to not have to talk about what's bothering him.
Yes,
listen to
her. So that was my contribution.
We just found the answer, everyone. We got to the root of that issue. Well, thank you both for sharing this vulnerable side of yourselves with me, because this wasn't one of the, the riskier tips, but it can feel very vulnerable to discuss something like this and to share these intimate details of your lives. And I appreciate you being so open about it.
We're really thrilled to be on the show, and we thank you for what you're doing and asking the important questions.
Thank you, Tonya.
But I'm not, you've inspired me to be more involved in getting the community. Like, I want to get on your list, man. I need to make sure I'm on her research list. I know what to find out. I'm not going to ask you who you're voting for, because I think that's a very private thing, but I will ask, what did your research find? Add me to the list. Will you please share with the audience where they can find you and connect with you and your books?
Yeah, I have a website, amandaskenandore.com, and I'm Facebook, Instagram, probably Instagram the most, Twitter very irregularly, just at Amanda Skenandore. And Steven is on Facebook too. Oh, and my books are available wherever books are sold, but always check with your indie bookstore first.
This last book, just recently, this last book was put into Walmarts and Sam's Clubs. I'm getting pictures of that all around the country. And I'm like, oh my goodness. This
that must be
great.
so fun to receive photos like that. I have your book.
It's unbelievable.
That reminds me, I need to post a picture of me with your book.
Oh, that is the best picture.
Steven, do you have any social media you wish to share?
I don't think so.
Okay, it's fine. I don't want to exclude you, but
no, it's okay. Thank you though. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and that you learned something from it. If you did, please like and share the episode and give Steven and Amanda some love in the comments. And until next time, remember to treat love as a verb.